Hello, welcome to week 12 of Advanced Museum and Gallery Studies. of Advanced Museum and Gallery Studies. And today's focus is going to be the collection display. So we'll start by considering what's described as a colonial problem of certain museum displays and their objects by looking at the collection at the British Museum. So that's focusing on objects that are on display and the problems that surround those objects. Then we'll examine the historical development of collection displays through key three types. So we'll look at the art historical hang, and the example we'll look at is the National Gallery in London. Then we'll move on and look at the modernist hang at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And finally, we'll look at the postmodern hang, and we'll look at Tate Liverpool as an example of that. And in each case, we'll examine three things: the content and the arrangement of those gallery hangs, the visitor experience, so the way they experience how the art is displayed, and also we'll look at some criticisms surrounding each of those hangs. So first of all, I very briefly want to have a look at the colonial problem with certain museum displays. So some museum and gallery spaces and their collections are still shaped by the politics, ideologies and aesthetics of the colonial period. So this is the period largely during the Victorian era, when there was an attempt to expand the British Empire into territories overseas. And as part of that expansion, some artifacts, objects, art from these different territories that became part of the British Empire were brought back to Britain, where they were then put on display in the national museums and galleries, the British Museum being a good example of that. And the display of certain museum collections, especially those that include objects and artworks originating from what now former colonies, has become increasingly problematic, certainly over the course of the last 50 years or so, due to the colonial past and the way that they were acquired. So a lot of these objects were acquired by various means. Some critics might say that they were stolen, or certainly not given to the British Empire in a particularly favourable way. And as Alice Proctor writes, it's not just about the objects or the images that have ended up in the museum's collection, but the way they've been displayed and how curators describe things, so how they create narratives around these objects. So, for example, there might be an object that was made for a particular reason. So it could be a ritualistic object or a spiritual object or something relating specifically to the culture of that territory, which has now been altered somehow since it's come to Britain. For example, the curators might not know what the main purpose of that object is, and so that's not accurately depicted in the labels that are written to accompany those objects. So you can see that there could be quite a cultural problem in the interpretation of these particular objects. So what I'd like you to do, we're not going to look at it here, but what I'd like you to do next week as part of Reflection Week is to have a look at this short clip, which is called "The British Museum is Full of Stolen Artifacts." It's just over 9 minutes long. And this really looks at this problem, and especially in relation to the British Museum. And while you're watching this video, I'd like you to look at or consider a couple of things. First of all, consider the cultural impact that these so-called stolen artifacts have had on the people or the nation who originally owned them. So from where they originally came. And also consider whether you think these objects should be returned to those nations from which they were in quote marks stolen. And you'll be able to see in the video how some objects in the collections, such as the British Museum, of course, are problematic due to how they were acquired. The Benin bronzes, for example, are just one example of these disputed objects on display in museums and galleries across Europe. So it's not just in Britain that this is a problem, but it's also in other countries that also had these imperialist views or missions, I suppose, during the Victorian period. So France, Belgium, Germany. So we have this problem not just in Britain, but also in other museums and galleries across Europe, and also in the USA as well. However, repatriation or the return of objects back to their original people or nation is often dependent on museum and gallery legislation. So such as the British Museum Act of 1963, which you may have looked at already in an earlier lecture with Judith. So the British Museum Act of 1963 says the following. This is item 5. Relating to the disposal of objects. So what the Act says is, number 1, that the trustees of the British Museum may sell, exchange, give away, or otherwise dispose of any object vested in them and comprised in their collections if, and there's 3 reasons. 3 is if the object is a duplicate. So for example, if they have 2 objects the same, they can get rid of one of them. If the object appears to the trustees to have been made not earlier than the year 1850. So anything made after that year isn't a problem. However, anything before that year, which is generally all the objects that are problematic, cannot be given away if they're made before 1850. And thirdly, if the object is unfit to be retained in the collection. So for example, if it becomes, if it loses some kind of worth as a research item for students, and this ties in with number 2, the trustees may destroy or otherwise dispose of any object vested in them and comprised in their collections if satisfied that it's become useless for the purposes of the museum by reason of damage, physical deterioration, or infestation. So what it's saying there is that they may dispose of objects or get rid of their objects if it's become damaged somehow, it's broken, or it's suffered from some kind of physical deterioration or infestation by insects, for example. So these are the only ways that an object can leave the collection of the museum. And you'll note that there's no mention here about repatriation. So therefore, the museum legislature would need to change to incorporate the return of objects to former colonies. And that's not currently the case. So the other problem with this is if legislature did change, if the policy did change, you could be looking at up to 1/3 of the collection of the British Museum, because many of the objects and artifacts in the British Museum were acquired during the colonial period. So you can see there is a problem here. So what I'd like to do now is move on and have a look at the collection display in more detail. And to do this, we're going to look at art museums, galleries, and we're going to have a look at how they have displayed their artwork over the course of the past 150 years or so. So I'd like to start just by looking at a quote. This is a book that we've mentioned in the past. This is The Art Museum from Boulay to Bilbao by Andrew McClellan. And what McClellan says is that all museums rely on classification and display to give their contents coherence and meaning. So classification and arrangement are the lifeblood of any collection. Collections differ from mere accumulations of objects by virtue of criteria of selection and the subsequent ordering of what is collected into meaningful categories and/or sequence. Collecting is done with a purpose and usually entails a finite set or series of objects that one strives to complete. Okay, so what we're looking at here is that art museums don't collect or display their collections randomly. Okay, they're not randomly displayed collections. They often have a specific system or classification that's used by these galleries or art museums. And art museums also, they used to be founded on the collections of private collectors. So a lot of what we see in the art museums were originally displayed by private collectors. But that tended to be determined by the collector's personal taste. So what you see here is a collection of art which was very much connected to that personal taste of the original collector. But galleries tend to be more scientific or systematic in their approach to how they display their artwork. They put their artworks generally into groups or categories so that they can be understood more coherently by the public. Okay. And galleries continue to collect, so they might be based on these private collections, but they continue to collect artwork. And most major national galleries in particular will have budgets for developing their collections. They'll also have what's called a collection development plan as well, to outline their system for collecting new works. So, for example, what objects are they interested in collecting? Why are they interested in collecting these objects? And how does the object fit into the current collection? So today what we're really concerned about is how these systems of classification or of ordering, classifying and making sense of collections are evident in these displays. So how do they take up the space in the museum? How are they communicated through the interpretations of display? That sort of thing. So before we move on and have a look at the art historical hang, I thought it might be worth having a look at the connections between private and public displays. So private collections have been influenced, have influenced how public museums display their artwork, how they're assembled and how they're grouped in the gallery spaces of the museum. So before we go on to discuss the art historical hang, I wanted to mention a type of hang that has influenced public art museums and galleries. And this is called the gentlemanly hang, which sounds a bit rude, but it's also known as the connoisseur's hang as well. So these are very much private collections of art. So there was as we know, there was a museum boom in the late 18th and early century, when these sort of museums were emerging, these art museums were emerging. And they were emerging in not only Europe, but also in the US as well, at a level, a national and a regional level. And this particular style of hang was usually practiced in the home of private collectors, who were generally wealthy, aristocratic gentlemen collectors. And they were collected to share these artworks privately amongst friends and like-minded individuals. And as I mentioned earlier, they were very much related to personal taste. So they were, you know, the personal taste of the collector. And of course, as I just mentioned, it was practiced throughout Europe. And a lot of these collections, these private collections, tended to collect the same kind of art that they considered to be superior of the time. So, for example, a lot of the collections consisted of 16th and 17th century Italian, Dutch, Flemish, and French painting. And also in this type of hang, the work was hung according to subject. So, for example, you might have a series of paintings depicting a Greek mythological character such as Venus, and they'd all be grouped together in the display. Or, for example, they might have some works depicting Christ and the Nativity, which again they would all group together. So, for example, they might have an Italian Venus and an Italian Nativity on one side of the display. On the other side, they might have a Flemish Venus and a Flemish Nativity, so that the viewers of this artwork can compare the qualities of the technique, the colour, and the composition of the different schools of artists. And this gentlemanly hang, or connoisseur's hang, tended to reflect and reinforce aristocratic taste in art. Okay. So we'll move on to the art historical hang. So this type of display is often attributed to the Louvre, the National Gallery of France, which was founded in post-revolutionary France in 1793. So this French National Gallery was founded at the time of that the French nation was founded, the Third Republic, which wanted to distance itself from the art of the monarchy and wealthy individual collectors. Of course, the Louvre was a former royal palace, which was transformed into a public museum. So they wanted to distance themselves from the private origins of the collections in order to gain public significance, public support. And when it first opened, the Louvre hung its paintings from frame to frame and floor to ceiling. So you can see similarities here with the gentlemanly hang that we've just looked at, where you've got every bit of the wall covered in artwork. And it's quite chaotic in display. And shortly after the Louvre was opened to the public, the National Gallery in London was also opened, another example of the art historical hang. So it was founded in 1824 and moved to its permanent premises in Trafalgar Square in 1838. And we looked at the example of this, we looked at the National Gallery when we did location a few weeks ago. And the select committee of the gallery sought to reorder its collections at this point. The gallery was influenced by the public museums in Europe, and the committee believed the historical ordering of the collection could instruct the wider public in art appreciation, and also to contribute to the social order of the nation. And again, we looked at the nation state and the significance of the nation state in the location lecture a few weeks ago. So here's a quote from Charles Locke Eastlake, who was a trustee and later the director of the National Gallery. And this is from 1853. And this was his proposed plan for a collection of paintings illustrative of the history of art. So this is one of these collection plans that I mentioned earlier. So this plan, which was endorsed by royalty, by Prince Albert, suggested that the gallery's collection should be as complete a school of art as it is possible to create. And with this view that the endeavour should not be merely to form a collection of pictures by good masters, such as a private gentleman might wish to possess, but to afford the best means of instruction and education in the art to those who wish to study it scientifically in its history and progress. A classified catalogue should exist, distinguishing the various schools of painting and enumerating the masters and principal followers of each in historical order. A glance at which should show not only what the gallery already contains, but what would be wanting to make such a collection complete. Okay, so what he's saying here is that there's a focus more on the educational purpose than the gentlemanly hangs. The gentlemanly hang was very much about like-minded individuals, intellectuals, for example, getting together to study art within the personal surroundings in a private location, and that would only be open to selected guests. Whereas here on a public level, the collection is more focused towards education, educating the public. And the collection at the National Gallery is split into schools of art with a focus on master artists. So those key artists of each of the periods and their masterpieces. So we've all heard the phrase a masterpiece, which is generally important for study. So for example, in the Louvre, we've got the Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece. And the schools are displayed in chronological order, so historical order. So it gives some sense of the passing of time and the developments over the passage of time. And this is a floor plan of the National Gallery in 1930. So let's have a look at this. So it's diachronic in scope. So that means it looks at the development of art through the different schools over a period of time. So for example, one school developed into another school, which in time developed into another school, and so on. So we can see these changes and developments throughout the course of art history. And also, the schools and the art was arranged geographically by nation and region. So we can have a look here. If we have a look at the floor plan, we can see. So we can see here. Well, first of all, we can see the shape of the building, which is we've looked at architecture already, and we can see you've got this central portico here, this doorway, and we've got the dome as well here. So it's very sort of neoclassical. So what the aim of this type of hang and this arrangement is that you would come in through the central door, and rather than just wandering around and looking for something that perhaps interests you, there is a specific system that the public is meant to follow in order to learn about the developments in art over the course of the past so many years, 150 or so years. So what they're trying to get you to do is go through the front portico and first of all stop in this central gallery, which is the Tuscan and Umbrian schools. So you'll see that a lot of these galleries in the center here are all the Italian schools. So they're all focused on Italian art across the last 150, 200 years or so. And they're also numbered. So they're suggesting that you go into this room first, number 1, then you go over to number 2, which is the Tuscan school, then to the Sienese school, and more Italian schools, the Florentine school. So they're all in order. The Venetian school up here, and back down into these. So there is a certain way that you are expected to follow as you go through the art gallery. And then if you look at the left-hand side, you'll see the British school over here. And moving around, you've got the French school, the German school, the Spanish school, Flemish, and up the right-hand side, we've got the Dutch school. So they are very much set out according to school. So the focus on stylistic developments, which is articulated particularly through the biographies of individual artists and their influence on each other. So for example, systems of tuition within these different schools, which designated the most prominent artists as masters and their students as followers. So you have the master, the tutor, the teacher, who was most prominent within that school. And you've also got some of the work of their followers or their students also displayed alongside them. A lot of these students were often imitators of the master. So what was the visitor experience then for the historical hang display? So this type of collection display addressed its visitor as a citizen who finds a culture that unites him with other citizens, regardless of their social position. So in each gallery, we see the development of the art and culture of each country and region over time within the schools. We also see the development of a national culture over time. So this is aimed to unite the citizens of that culture, regardless of their social position. So regardless of their class, their gender, their race, etc. So it aims to unite citizens. And you can see in the picture we've got at the front what looks like a working class man who is in conversation with more wealthier looking characters there, and they're all sharing, the knowledge of the artwork and sort of learning about the artwork as an attempt to sort of unite everybody together. And this type of display also reinforced the presence of the state acting on behalf of the public as keeper and interpreter of the nation's culture. So in other words, the Board of Trustees' role was very much acting on behalf of the government, the state. And we learned again in the lecture on location that the state refers to the government. So there's still this government involvement in national galleries and how the artwork is displayed. And it's the Board of Trustees that decides how the art is going to be displayed and what art is displayed. Okay, so there are some criticisms about the style of the art historical hang. So what are these criticisms? So critics have argued that the art historical hang is limited in its historical and public value because it favours, for example, style over content. So there's more importance and emphasis placed on stylistic content of an artwork rather than on the subject matter itself. And also it favours authorship over social context. So for example, emphasis on the artist's biography and how their life shaped their artwork, rather than the social context of the world that the artist lived in that might have influenced their work. And also production over use. So for example, how master artists produced masterpieces, but with very little information about who commissioned that artwork, for example, or where it was displayed before it came into the public museums. So another criticism is by Christopher Whitehead in his book, Museums and the Construction of Disciplines from 2009. So Whitehead has argued that the art historical hangs suppress the subject matter and social histories of art with the intent of maintaining the dominant social order. So his quote is that the subject matter of historical painting was potentially dangerous. For example, consider the question of morality in Greek mythology or of religious doctrine in Catholic imagery, and hinted at past and or foreign societal mores and practices which would have been unacceptable in mid-century Britain. Okay, so what he's saying then is that by deliberately avoiding a focus on social context and subject matter of the art, the galleries were avoiding a disturbance of the social order. So, in other words, they're avoiding any debate surrounding subject matter that might be potentially dangerous or may lead to maybe civil unrest or for example, the question of morality. There was no attempt to discuss the question of morality, which runs throughout Greek mythology, or Catholicism in biblical artworks. This might raise unwanted debate amongst the public who are viewing these artworks. So to keep the peace, in other words. So that's the art historical hang. So let's compare that now with a new form of display that came into being around about the 1930s, and this is called the modernist hang. So again, this is the National Gallery in London, but this is in 1935. So in the early 20th century, public museums began to be influenced by commercial galleries, which focused the displays on quality over quantity. So these were the galleries that were selling artwork, for example, the commercial galleries. And they displayed the work that was on sale in a certain way to enable potential buyers to view the work in the best possible way, I suppose, best possible light. So by the 1930s, several prominent European art galleries had started to rehang their collections in order to emphasize the best works of art. So more focus on the better artworks in the collection, with items of a lesser quality held in storage just for research purposes. So what they're doing is they are changing this floor to ceiling display style that we saw in the art historical hang. And they're sort of concentrating more on a lesser number of artworks on display. So they're focusing on what they would consider to be the most important artworks. And anything of a lesser importance, a lesser quality, would be removed and placed into storage, which they could still be accessed, but only by people who are perhaps doing research into that artist or that type of artwork. So, so this style of display is what we see today in an art gallery to an extent, where you go in and you see a series of artworks side by side in display. So people go from one work to the next work to the next work, giving the same amount of attention to each work. And although the art historical hang prevailed in some galleries, the new style of hang enabled the viewer to contemplate the aesthetic quality of a fewer examples of art. So like I say, there was no, people weren't going in looking and having to try and take in everything on the wall at once. They were able to go from one work to another and take in the aesthetic qualities of each piece. So the example I want to look at in relation to the modernist hang is the 1935 History of Modern Art by Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art or MoMA in New York. So we can see here, this is the planned system, I suppose, at MoMA. So the Museum of Modern Art in New York was sought to build on the art historical traditions of the public museum, but by adopting the new aesthetic trend in display. MoMA was founded in 1929, and it sought to create its own chronology of modernist art, which had not yet been integrated into the dominant art historical system of public display. So, for example, there was more focus on different styles in art history. So we can see from this, this image that rather than schools, we've got different styles of art, different movements of art, dating from 1890 right the way through till 1935 in this case. So you can see we've got starting at the top with Simplicism and Neo-Impressionism, moving down through Fauvism, Cubism, Suprematism, Constructivism, Futurism, Dadaism, and so on. But there's also still emphasis on the master as well, the artist himself. So you can see at the top there's a mention of Van Gogh, and then you can see other references to other Brassai. Just make out a few more names there. Duchamp, for example. So there's still more there's still emphasis on the master artist as well. So this was the plan by Alfred Barr, who was MoMA's first curator in the 1930s. Okay, so this is the interior of MoMA in 1939. And you can see it's very much the white cube layout. So what the modernist hang did was it still maintained a chronological order, but it focused on a much more limited period. So it focused on what we consider to be modernist art. So that from the 19th century to the then present, which was 1935. And it was arranged by international or stylistic movements such as post-impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, Futurism, Surrealism, abstract expressionism. So all the isms. And it also articulated through the achievements of individual artists, like we saw, there was a reference to Van Gogh, but also individual artists such as Cézanne, Picasso, Duchamp, Pollock, and Rothko. And the visitor experiences MoMA's chronology of modern art as progress towards greater and greater abstraction. So it illustrates the development from figurative art of the late 19th century to more abstract art. So you can still see this diachronic sort of display style that we saw in the art historical hang. So development of art across time. But it's moved more from figurative art, so more realism, to increasingly more abstract styles of art. The visitor is invited to reenact the drama of the Enlightenment, in which spiritual freedom is won by repeatedly overcoming and moving beyond the visible material world. So, for example, moving away from realism to this more abstract form of art. And again, like the art historical hang, the modernist hang also has its critics. One of the critics is Brian O'Doherty, who wrote Inside the White Cube in 1986. So what O'Doherty argues is that the white cube style of modernist display developed by MoMA was designed to eliminate the distractions of the outside world, focusing the spectator's gaze solely on the work itself. So we can see we saw from the image, if I can just quickly go back, So we can see the difference in the style of the art gallery and the style of the hang here, which has removed all the clutter that we saw earlier in the art historical hang. So we haven't got all these, mismatch of art all over the place. We've just got a focused number of important artworks. He argues that the white cube contributed to the development of a particularly self-referential type of modernist abstract painting, concerned only with formalist principles, such as flatness. So in that respect, in some of the paintings in the art historical hang, you see the perspective and different types of sort of composition, which is different to what we saw in the modernist hang, for example, the work of Jackson Pollock, which was very much abstract and with this flatness, or very specific perspective. He also concludes that the white cube is not a neutral space, but instead infused with content that validates and privileges this type of artwork and the people that make, buy, and sell it. It stands for a community with common ideas and assumptions. So, for example, this type of hang, this type of art that was being displayed reflected the taste, particularly of wealthy art collectors of the time, such as the American elite. I remember this is an art gallery, a new art gallery in New York. So it reflects the taste of the wealthy art collectors of the time, such as American elite, like the Rockefellers, for example. Very, very wealthy family in America who actually helped to found MoMA. So you can see there's this new elite set of art collectors who were particularly drawn to this sort of hang, this sort of gallery. So let's have a look at how the collection display progressed towards the end of the 20th century. We have the emergence of what's called a postmodern hang. So by the late 20th century, notions of a single authoritative history of art were being challenged by the new art historical methodologies. So these included things like Marxism, attitudes of art, Marxist attitudes, feminist attitudes, psychoanalytic and post-structuralist attitudes towards art. So these new methodologies, new ways of reading and interpreting art were coming into place. Similarly, notions of a single correct way of understanding or interpreting artwork were being challenged by the pluralism of meanings revealed by these new methodologies. So people were starting to look at how art had traditionally been interpreted and were starting to question that. So one example is this poster, which is by a female protest group called the Guerrilla Girls. Used to go around museums and protest about the way, about the collection, the way it was displayed, and the content as well of these displays. So this one is, it's got the slogan, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? So this is referring to the Met in New York. And it's pointing out that less than a third of the artists in the modern art sections of the Met are women. So less than a third are women. But 83% of the nudes in the Met are female. So they're sort of showing the controversy here regarding the number of artists that are being displayed compared to the number of naked women that are being displayed in the artwork within this museum. So that's very much a feminist protest about the art. So we'll have a look at an example of this postmodernist hang in the Tate Liverpool. So in 1981, the Tate director Alan Bowness outlined his plans for the collection displays at Tate Liverpool. And this was before Tate Liverpool actually opened. He writes, "We have in mind special displays of selections of the collection. For example, Cubism, abstraction, surrealism. Each display would remain in Liverpool for about a year, while other parts of the modern collection would probably find a permanent home in Liverpool. I think in particular of our fine collection of British sculpture of the 1960s, which can only inadequately be shown at Millbank and would look magnificent in the Albert Dock warehouse buildings. So what he's saying here is that the artwork, the art that you can hang in the gallery, would generally be rotated. So it would just remain for about a year or so before being changed. So rather than having a permanent display of art, there was some moving the display around accordingly, maybe depending on exhibitions and what's being shown as part of exhibitions, or just to rotate the art generally. And other parts would probably find a permanent home. So some of the more static artworks, the sculptures, for example, would probably find more permanent collections. And what he's saying here is that they can only inadequately be shown at their original location at Millbank, which is where the Tate Modern is located. But they would look magnificent in the new space at the Albert Dock warehouse, in the warehouse buildings of the Tate in Liverpool. So Bowness's intention was to display only sections of the wider collection, which illustrates a shift from diachronic displays to synchronic displays. So no longer are we showing artwork in a chronological historical order through schools and developments in art, but they're more synchronic. So they don't necessarily hang in order, any particular type of order. And he also comments, he also illustrates the intensification of the aesthetic, focusing on the spatial rather than temporal experience of art. So there's more emphasis on space and the use of space, and how these galleries use space in order to display their artwork. And this emphasis is on synchronic arrangements and spatial experience, which categorizes the postmodern collection displays. So it's more about space rather than on any systematic form of display. So the visitor experience then of the postmodern hang, well, the Tate Liverpool's collections are displayed generally in these vast open gallery spaces, punctuated by individual artworks, which could be viewed in any order from a variety of perspectives, but which on entering the gallery would have the effect of first striking the visitor all at once. So what he's saying here is that when you walk into the Tate Gallery, into the sculpture gallery, it's just one massive space with different sculptures spread throughout that space. And the public can come in, they can walk around, they can go to any particular sculpture that they fancy. There's no specific route around the gallery, there's no structure, there's no sort of guide on which to go to first. You can go to whichever you want, and you can walk around the sculpture as well. So you can see it from different perspectives as well. So it is very much about using space and the visitor experience within that space with the artworks. But again, the postmodern hang has its criticisms, like the other two we've looked at. And in this case, it's Rosalind Krauss, who argues that the themed hangs of postmodern museums encourage a purely spatial experience of art that obscures its distinct geographical and historical context, which is true. It's not, the artwork isn't necessarily displayed by geographical region or following a historical context like you would see in the art historical hang or the modernist hang. It allows the visitor to just experience the art, in its own sort of for itself, basically. So look at the individual artworks for what they are, rather than how they connected in art history and how they were developed in a certain sort of chronological order. So Krauss also interprets these postmodern collection displays as a commodification of the museum experience, reducing its purpose to the realm of commercial leisure, like Disneyland, for example. So it's more about the experience within this space in the postmodern hang. And what she's saying is that the way that the collection is being displayed is very much like attending a amusement park, for example. You can go wherever you like. You can go to each of the artworks in any particular order, just like you would with rides in an amusement park. You can pretty much it's about the experience rather than the artworks in themselves. So just to conclude, then, each type of collection display that we've looked at today is not exclusive, but it builds on the authority of previous models. So, for example, MoMA's modernist displays adapted the chronological approach of the preceding artist's historical displays, while Tate Liverpool's postmodern displays intensified the aesthetic focus of preceding modernist displays. So there is that relationship between each of these types of hang. Although all three of the display types have been criticised for the removal of art from its wider social, cultural and political contexts. So more focus on the art and on the artist rather than on the social, cultural and political context within which the art was created. And all three have also reinforced the dominant social order. For example, Victorian moral codes and the art historical hang, elitist formalist tastes in modern art and the modernist hang, or the commercial functions of global capitalism in the postmodern hang. So, just moving on to the seminar then. In the seminar, we were looking at another type of collection display. And this is the Cabinet of Curiosities. And what I want you to have a look at, this video as part of Reflective Week next week. And I want you to consider the Cabinet of Curiosities' purpose within a historical and cultural context. It's very much related to the private collection, and it is very specific of its time. So when you watch this video, just think about the following questions. First of all, cabinets of curiosities were often an indicator of social status, like the private collection. But how is it an indicator of social status symbol, I suppose? What types of objects were traditionally displayed in these cabinets of curiosity? Did you find any of the objects surprising or shocking, and why? And finally, some of the objects symbolize the Victorians' fascination with death and mortality. Which ones? So have a look at this this documentary. It's about half an hour long, and just have a think about those questions while you're watching it, and just I suppose you can compare this with what we've looked at already, in particular the private collection. So next week it's Reflection Week, so there won't be any lecture next week, but I will set a couple of tasks for next week. Part of that will be to have a look at the video on the Cabinets of Curiosities, and also to look at the short video on the colonial problem in the British Museum, which I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. So the next lecture will be a week after next on the Blockbuster exhibition. So I'll see you then.